The meeting is now live on YouTube.
Right, thank you. Right, well, good evening, everybody, and welcome to the West Northamptonshire Shadow Overview and Scrutiny Committee meeting. We've got a very busy agenda tonight, and we've also got a lot of people joining us who are going to offer their support to the meeting and the material that we're going to be looking at. So if we could have any apologies, please, Tracy, before we get going.
Yes, we have apologies from Councillor Flavel, Councillor Roberts, Councillor Morris, Councillor Wesley, and Councillor Jamie Lane will be joining the meeting at 6:30.
Right, thank you. Wonderful. Right, do we have any notifications of requests to address our meeting?
No, we have none.
Right, thank you. Any declarations of interest that have not already been registered? No? Okay, thank you. Right, well, I hope you've all had a chance to look at the agenda for tonight. As I said, it is a busy agenda, it's fairly full, and it's going to be led by Martin Henry, who is the 151 officer. To help with that, we have a number of people who are joining us to support this session. Councillor Rebecca Breeze, welcome to you. Thank you very much for joining us. Rebecca is the chair of the Council Tax Harmonisation Task and Finish Group, and they've had several meetings, and the material that we're going to be looking at tonight hopefully has also been discussed in the Task and Finish Group meetings, and we're hoping that Rebecca will be able to share some of that discussion with us and help us to understand it's a very, very complicated systems there. We have George Candler, who is the interim CEO of the West Northampton Shadow Authority, and George will be talking about the future plans. Martin Henry is 151 interim officer for the West Northampton Shadow Authority, and he'll be leading the session this evening. To support Martin, we have Paul Heimers and Belinda Green, who are finance officers. So thank you very much for coming along. And we have Susan Weiss, who is the interim monitoring officer for the West Northampton Shadow Authority. So having introduced all our support officers, we can perhaps get on with the minutes. Have you all had a chance to look at the minutes from the last meeting? It was the 16th of July. And have you got sight of the minutes, everyone? Can we go through them page by page? Right, page 1. Anybody got a problem with that? All right, can we agree page 2? It lists some of the areas that we would like to be looking at. I think they're going to be covered later. Page 3, so consolidate some of that discussion into 4 areas: finance, governance, transformation program, communication, and engagement. So those were the topics that were brought up for consideration by this committee. Summary and evaluation. Do you agree the minutes? Yes, I don't see any dissent there. Thank you very much indeed for that. So, on to item 6 on our agenda for tonight. The Overview and Scrutiny Committee is to receive an update on finance and the issues associated with council tax harmonisation and the council tax reduction scheme. This is something that is going to affect all of our constituents. Council tax is one of the most talked about areas, and changes do provoke a huge amount of discussion and debate. Martin is going to take us through some of the background to the work that has been done already in the council tax harmonisation task and finish group. And I think all of us have a very vested interest in this because it does affect us as well as the people that we represent. So I think it's important for us to understand the implications of these changes and the way that they would, the difference it would mean to the finances and the obligations of the people that we represent. Martin, when you go through this, would you rather take questions as you go through, or would you rather wait until the end?
Thank you, Chair. I'm quite happy to take questions as we go through. I think it becomes a bit more interactive if we take that approach. So if somebody in Democratic Service can signal when somebody's got their virtual hand up, and I can pause and take questions as we go along, if that's okay with you.
That's fine. If you can use the virtual hand, we can then perhaps call people in one at a time, and Martin can answer the questions in sequence. Right. So over to you, Martin.
Okay, thank you, Chair. And I don't know if Councillor Breeze just wanted to say a few words to kick off before I go into
yes,
some presentation slides that I've got.
Yes.
Thank you. My task and finish group started with council tax harmonisation and local council tax reduction in June as a precursor to the bigger piece of work, which of course is preparing the medium-term financial plan, which we have now started just this month. Council tax in the West will account for circa £207 million of our budget, which is going to be circa 300 million. So it's a substantial part of the money raising part of any council's budget, but certainly for the new authority. So it affects not just the services that the authority can provide, but it will also have an impact on our residents, because as things stand, there is a variation in the council tax charged by the three authorities that make up the New West and of course in the background we all have the same charge that's imposed by Northampton County Council. So what the group did in the first instance was to look at how we can harmonise the council tax in South Northampton, Daventry and the borough, against the basis that there's quite a wide disparity at the moment in the council tax collected. So for example, Daventry, if you take a Band D house, and I think all the references when talking about individual council tax tonight will be set against a Band D property. But in Daventry, for this year, Band D property, excluding fire and police, is £1,451 per household. In the borough, it's 1,516, and in South Northampton, it's 1,481. So it's a variance of about £70. That has to be harmonised between the three authorities by the beginning of year 8 after the start of vesting date. So Martin will go into the detail, but there are two different methods that we're allowed to use to harmonise council tax. And the task and finish group were very mindful of the impact on our residents, but particularly on the budget for the New West Authority, because whichever approach we took would have a financial impact to the tune of about £7 million. It is a very detailed subject. It took quite a lot of time for us all to get to grips with what we were looking to agree, but we did come to a conclusion, and Martin will go into the detail, but the decision we have made is the one that will collect the most income for the authority to use in delivering our services. Do you want me to cover both, because they're quite different and they are quite complicated, Jane? So shall we just deal with the council tax harmonisation first, and Martin can go into the background then, and then we'll move on to the council tax reduction? Okay, thank you.
I think the council tax harmonisation is slightly more straightforward. The council tax reduction scheme is far more varied. There's a greater variance in that. So yes, I think
Exactly.
if we're happy with that, Martin, we'll do the harmonisation, the council tax before we go on to the other.
And then I'll come back and introduce the local council tax reduction part of it. So
brilliant. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. Thank you, Chair. With the agenda pack was a report which described council tax harmonisation and CTRS at a fairly high level. What I've done is I've put together some slides which pick up a bit more detail. I'm looking to share my screen now, so if Democratic Services can just unlock my screen so I can share. I'll take you through some slides which give a bit more information, and I'll go into how we actually do the calculation, and you can ask questions as we go through. So if you just bear with me whilst we seek to share the screen. So hopefully you'll be able to see that now. Could somebody just nod to let me know that you can see the slide? Yeah, lovely. Okay, so the report kind of summarises the situation. This gives a bit more detail and it just goes through. I'll walk you through in terms of what the calculations are, what the options are, what the legislation says, and things like that. As I said right at the start, I think these sessions are much more interactive if we get questions as we go through. So please feel free to stop me when I'm presenting. And between me and Paul Heimers, so Paul Heimers has done a lot of the detailed or all the detailed calculations behind the council tax harmonisation side of this presentation. So Paul will be able to respond to some of the detailed questions if they come forward. And on the council tax reduction scheme, Belinda Green's been fundamental in pulling that information together. And in actual fact, we've got some case studies as part of this presentation. And when we come to those slides, Belinda will take us through those slides. So this is just a bit of background information that you've got, and Councillor Breese has covered some of this already. You've got the constituent authorities there, Daventry, Northampton, South North Hants. You've got the tax base, which they've got in each of those areas. The tax base is an indication of the number of properties in each of those areas. It is based on a Band D property, so it's averaged out to give you an average Band D property across that particular district or borough. So you've got a consistent base of comparing across the different parts of the authorities. So you've got the tax base figures there, and that effectively is an indicator of how many houses there are across Daventry, Northampton, South Northants. The county council element of the council tax for 2020-2021 is 1285.42, and that'll be the same across all of the county. So not just here in the west, but across the north as well. And then you've got the differing parts of the council tax. So you've got Daventry, including their special expenses, will levy an additional £166.14. Northampton, an additional £230.84. South Northants, an additional £196.33. And excluding town precepts, town councils, parish councils, police and fire, these are the elements that we are left that we have to harmonise. And that comes to it currently in each of those constituent areas. You've got the figures for Daventry at 1451.56. The total for Northampton, excluding those areas, is 1516.26. South Northants 148.75. From that information, we can then work out what the average council tax will be. And I won't go into that calculation as part of this slide. I'll come back to that in a minute or two. But that can give you an indication of what if there was an average council tax across the whole of West Northamptonshire, how much that would be. And when that's calculated, that's 1491.94. Interestingly, if you look at the average Band D council tax on a comparable basis for English Shire unitaries, that's 1541. So we start off behind the position of other English Shire unitaries when we look at our average council tax across the West, and you compare it to the average elsewhere. The final column on the right hand side then just shows how far behind the average each of Daventry, or above the average, each of Daventry, Northampton and South Northants are. So Daventry is 2.71% below the average. Northampton is 1.63% above. South Northants just slightly below, 0.68% below.
Sorry, Martin. I did tried to raise my hand because you said I can take a question.
Yep.
People in Northampton are not going to be happy with this, are they? I mean, it's purely and simply that people who live in Northampton, our council tax is going to be a lot higher than it is in Daventry and South Northants. I mean, you know, I've got to go back and say to my residents, well, look, you're going to have to pay more than they're paying in Daventry, and we're the same. Can you explain that, please?
Okay. Yeah, so I think we'll come on to that later on when we go through some of these slides. I think the information you've got in front of you now on this slide actually shows that currently, in this current financial year, this is what Northampton currently pays. So currently, compared to, let's say, Daventry, Northampton residents are paying 1516.26, which is greater than Daventry residents, which is greater than South Northants residents. They, of course, will get slightly different services within each of those areas, and that can account for some of the variances there. But it's also based on the local decisions that historically have taken place over time. So in terms of jumping to the conclusion of this means that Northampton Borough residents will pay more, that decision hasn't been taken yet. In actual fact, I think it would work the other way. I think at the moment, if you look at this information, it's shown that Northampton Borough actually pay more council tax than the other areas. And what we've got to do is we've got to harmonise those figures over a period of time.
Ken Pritchard.
Joined the meeting.
Ken Ritchie also has a question, Martin.
Mm-hmm.
Ken.
Yes, you might want to return to this later, but it just strikes me that, you know, the different tax rates in the, you know, in the three constituent parts of West Northants, the question comes up, well, do people get different things for their money at the moment? You know, what are people in Northampton paying for that they're not paying for, say, in Daventry? Now, you know, I feel that if I were a Northampton councillor, I would be worried unless I could say, look, you know, you're paying a little bit more than Daventry, but look how much more we're actually getting in Northampton. And I just wonder if in the, you know, in the equalisation process, we're making sure that we, you know, we're moving into a position in which all parts of the, you know, all parts of the unitary area are going to be treated equally in terms of services, in terms of what they actually get for their money. But I appreciate the complication that is going to go with that too. Daventry is making plans to transfer certain things to its town council, perhaps more going to, you know, to parish councils. I understand you're going through the same process in Northampton. And so the amount that people will actually pay will, of course, not be the same, because it will depend on what the, you know, on what the precepts are for the, you know, for the town councils and parish councils. Is that something that comes under, you know, that comes into your rationalisation, equalisation calculation?
So in answer to that last question, no, that doesn't. So these figures exclude town precepts and town council precepts and parish council precepts because they have their own tax raising powers, and therefore we don't have to harmonise that, and you know, it wouldn't be for us to harmonise that. What we do have to harmonise are the county council elements of it and the district and borough elements of it. I think you're right. I think there will be different levels of services which are currently provided across West Northamptonshire. And I think there will also have been, for various reasons, not just level of service reasons, but for political reasons, for a variety of reasons, there will have been historic decisions taken on the level of council tax increases going back years upon years upon years upon years, which has got us into this position, and which has got us into this position that across Daventry, Northampton and South Northants, there's a difference between the different amounts of council tax that is levied. What we have to do as part of moving to West Northamptonshire is we have to rectify that, and we have to have a harmonised council tax going forward. And that's what this exercise seeks to do.
Martin, there's also a question from Julie Davenport.
Mm-hmm.
Julie.
Can you hear me now?
Yes.
I can,
yes,
yeah.
we can.
Yeah.
Yes.
Oh, good, good. Going on from what Ken Ritchie was saying about Daventry and Northampton discrepancy. Now, I could be wrong. However, I've always been told, you know, when we're on planning, that a lot of the buildings owned by Daventry that was on the boundaries could have added to that problem for us and how much it was costing us with our services. Because although all the council tax went to Daventry, we were actually paying for services for people on the boundary.
Oh, you've lost your sound, Julie.
Or... Oh, is it gone?
Yeah, you're back
Hello?
now. You're back. You're back now. You're fine now.
Oh, right. Yes, so I didn't know whether, because I find that quite interesting with Daventry and Northampton, and I just wondered whether that was the reason why, because I thought that going to a unitary was meant to be better for Northampton because of that reason, that it would level the playing field, so to speak.
And through you, Chair, some of that we will come on to.
Yes.
So this is just the first slide, and all this does is this sets out the current situation in terms of the council tax that's being charged in this financial year, based on decisions that have been taken up to this point, and based on historic decisions that have been taken over a number of years. So in terms of how we harmonise, when we harmonise, what that means to the finances, etc., we'll come on to that as part of some of these slides as we go forward.
It was only because it had been mentioned.
Okay, thank you. Right.
Okay.
Anybody else with a question, Martin?
Okay, so the final point on this slide was a point that Councillor Breeze has raised already. Actually, the total amount of council tax income is significant. It funds probably, we don't have the final figures yet, but probably about 2/3 of the total net budget for West Northamptonshire once that budget has been set. So it's a significant amount of money, £207 million. So these are the kind of the rules and the options that we've got in terms of harmonisation. So it is clear in the regulations that by year 8, by the start of year 8, council tax levels have to be harmonised. So if we think of the last slide, when we've got differences between the 3 constituent areas, they have to all they all have to be paying the same amount. And it's really important to stress at this point, we should stop referring back to the historic areas, because we are setting and we are harmonising the council tax for a new and single organisation. So that's what we should be making reference to, and that's the task that we need to do. We need to look at how we harmonise council tax for West Northamptonshire going forward. There are 2 approaches that we've got in relation to how we do that. So the first consideration that we need to have is, which approach do we take? The first approach, and I'll come on to some detailed figures in a minute and the calculation in a minute. The first approach is, do we take the average council tax level across this area and apply the referendum limits to those, or do we apply the referendum limits to each individual area? So there's 2 approaches. Once we've taken a decision on which approach to use, there are ramifications in terms of the effect on the finances relating to the harmonisation period, but I'll come on to that in a few minutes' time. Through all of this financial modelling that's been done, and there's detailed spreadsheets that back up all of this, we have to build in assumptions. So the assumptions that we built in, and we're not saying that these are going to be, but we need to build some assumptions in. They possibly will change going forward. We don't know what they will be until we get things like provisional settlement information from government in around about December time, but we need to base the financial modelling on assumptions. So we've included an assumption that the referendum limit will be 3.99%, which includes the adult social care precept. And we've also assumed that there'll be no growth in the tax base. Now, the reason for there being no growth in the tax base in the assumption, which will change, and I'll keep stressing that point, they are just assumptions. The reason that we've assumed that is because of COVID-19 and the impact that that's having. So whereas ordinarily we might have expected properties to grow and grow and grow over a period of time, we're not sure if that's going to be the case at the moment. So we are taking a relatively prudent view, and we're saying, instead of seeing our tax base grow over a period of time, we're actually assuming there's going to be no change going forward. We will change that. We will amend that assumption as we get more and better information as we go through the budget setting process. So I'm going to now take you through the two approaches, because this is the first consideration that you need. And this looks like a really busy slide, but I'm going to try and walk you through it. The bullet points make reference to the fact that this first approach is the average council tax approach for West Northamptonshire. It re-emphasises the point that the assumption is that there'll be an increase in council tax of 3.99%, but there has been no decision on that. We don't know what the referendum limits are. It's an assumption at this stage, and that's it. And it just re-emphasises the fact that there's an assumption that there'll be no increase in tax base between this financial year and the next financial year. If we come down to this part of the screen, you can actually see the tax base figures which were included on the first slide, and that's effectively the number of properties on a Band D level across the whole of each of those different areas, Daventry, Northampton, South Northants. You can see the figures that are currently being charged from council tax in 2021. So the Daventry figure 145156, 1516.26 Northampton, 148175 for South Northants. You times 32446 by 145156, and you get the total tax yield, and that's that figure there, that 47 million. You do the same for the other two areas, Northampton and South Northants, and that gives you the 207.1 million total council tax yield that we're expecting. What we then have to do is we have to recast what the average would be. So it isn't simply a case of taking these three figures here and dividing by 3, because we need to take into account the different tax bases within the different areas. So what we do is we take this total tax yield, we divide it by the tax base, and that gives you then this consistent average council tax, which is recast in this current financial year. So if there was an average council tax which was charged in this year, and this is just a notional theoretical figure, that it would be that figure there, it would be 1491.94. If you then compare that to what's actually being charged in the different areas, Daventry's figure would actually increase by 2.8%, Northampton's would decrease by 1.6%, South Northants would increase by 0.7% to get up to that average level. The calculation, just find my cursor again, that calculation there then just takes the average council tax multiplied by the tax base to give you these revised recast figures here. You add those three figures up for the three different areas, and you come back to the same figure that we started with here to demonstrate that that reconciles back. If you then decided to harmonise in year 1, what that would do is you would then take the 3.99% assumption that we built into the financial modelling, and that would increase the 149194 to 155147 by the same amounts over each of those areas, and that would give you these revised council tax yields. So if you were using the average council tax model, this approach 1, and you move to that average council tax, and you then increase that average council tax by 3.99%, you actually would generate £215.4 million worth of council tax for 2021-2022. One of the comparisons that's bound to take place is, okay, so if you then compare the 21-22 figure based on the average council tax back to what's currently being charged, what's the increase? And it's these figures here. So there will be an increase within Daventry. If you harmonise using approach 1, using the average approach for 2021-22, there will be an increase compared to the current year with it for Daventry residents of 6.88%. For Northampton residents, it would be 2.32%, and for South Northants, it would be 4.71%. So the overall increase is 3.99%, because that's based on the referendum limit assumption increase, but they are the increases for the different areas. I think I'll pause at that stage, Chair, just to see if there's any questions on that detailed calculation that I was just taking you through.
Just to emphasise to the committee that is if we harmonise in year 1.
Yeah.
And that is an approach we can take, but we haven't reached a conclusive decision yet. But that's if we harmonise in year 1.
Yeah.
And so we actually have 7 years to harmonise. So those figures are going to be adjusted.
And it's these percentage figures here that Councillor Breese is referring to.
Yes, yes.
So that the impact is less dramatic. on, particularly we're mindful of the headline impact on Daventry and South of Hants.
Right. There's a question from Alan Walker. Alan, if you'd like to put your question.
Yeah, Martin. As you know, we've probably been through this over the years, especially with South Northants. The question I've got is that on the basis of fairness, if nothing else, I just understand, I mean, Rebecca answered some part of the question. If we didn't go with the 3.99, would we achieve the budget we require in the 8 years when it has to be harmonised, if that's the right word to use? Or alternatively, what is the reasoning behind looking at an indicative 3.99 referendum increase? Because in real terms, I mean, Daventry's going to suffer really badly because they're going to go up by 6.88%. I mean, okay, we'll go up by 4.71 and so will Northampton. But if you go on to the one that you've done previously, where it's only 2.8, Northampton actually gains by minus 1.6 and 0.7. So can you just give us the reasoning behind the two, and or what would or whose decision at some stage would it be, once we all understand this, in relation to whether it be one or t'other, either the current, just the average increases, or the referendum increase? Does that make sense, Martin?
Yes, it does. I'm just going to re-emphasise Councillor Breeze's point, actually, because these percentage increases here do look quite steep, but that is based on an indicative harmonisation of moving to a harmonised approach within year one. There are options in terms of when you move to a harmonised approach, and if you take a greater period than 1 year, so you move over over a 2 year, 3 year, 4 year, 5 year period or whatever, that affects these percentage increases. So it's worth just highlighting that. This is just indicative, and this was just trying to provide a comparison to say if you did move to year one, this would be the kind of increase. It absolutely is not saying this is the approach to be taken. If I can just go back to, I think there's a point I need to make about governance. If I go back to the Council Tax Harmonisation Task and Finish Group, they will make recommendations into the Shadow Executive, and there is a report which is going to the Shadow Executive, which is next week, which has been published this afternoon, and the Shadow Executive will then make decisions in terms of what approach to take in relation, final decisions in terms of what approach to take in relation to council tax increase and harmonisation going forward. So I think it's really important to emphasise that, because at this stage, we are sharing information. There have been no decisions that have been taken. There have been recommendations that are coming out of the Task and Finish Group. They will go into Shadow Executive for consideration, and that's the stage we're at. In relation to your question about the 3.99% and which approach to take, I think I need to take you through approach 2 as well, because then I've got some slides which will then show how approach 1 compares to approach 2 in terms of impact on the overall finances, and then it'll become evident which is better off, which is better financially for the authority going forward. I guess I'm always going to say, as a CFO, we should be trying to maximise our council tax, because we know that the cost of services is significant. We know that we've got huge pressures in relation to demand-led services, and particularly in relation to COVID-19. So if we can maximise our council tax income going forward, then we should do that, would be my officer view, but I know it's a political decision.
There's a couple more questions, Martin, before we move on. Ken Ritchie and then Andre.
Thank you. Just so I can check my understanding, looking at the right-hand box on the screen, if we were to harmonise in a single year, Daventry would increase by 6.88%.
Right.
If we were to stagger it over a number of years, then these figures still would be the targets that the target adjustments that we would be wanting to make. It would delay the rate by which people in Daventry move towards that 6.88. Is that correct?
So your first part is correct in terms of if you move to these figures in year one, the Daventry increase would be 6.88%. Your second part in terms of if you stagger that over a longer period, the percentages would go down. And And I think rather than, I think I can provide a better response to that in a couple of slides time, because we actually start looking at some of the options and saying, if you choose to take approach 1 over this time period, this is what it means. And you'll see some of those figures in a couple of slides time.
Well, let me just throw in a question, and don't answer it if it's coming up. If we were to harmonise over, say, 4 years, that I assume would mean that for the next 4 years, the increase in council tax that would be charged of people in Daventry would be higher than in other parts of the unitary. I'm not saying that's good or bad. I just think, you know, if it needs to be recognised that that those who are, some would say, getting the advantage of a low council tax are going to need to adjust, whether it comes in a single year over a number of years.
Yeah.
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 Okay.
Are you going to explain that later, Martin? Because we've got Andre with a question as well at this stage.
Yeah, I'll come back to that later, because we've got some options for the different approaches. Not every single option, because there's
right, Andre.
Thanks very much.
Indicative options.
Martin, thank you for the introductory slide there, and to Rebecca, thank you for the explanation going through your start and finish work group there. I am absolutely sort of sure that in the not just the big headline grabbing important opportunities, but in knowing our economy well, that we all have good feelers there, we all understand the communities. There won't be one single person who will welcome any sort of tax rise at all going forward this year or next year. That's an absolute guarantee. Not just because the economy has been hit so badly, but because of the fact that quite clearly with the unitary plans in place, the whole element of the unitary discussion and debate and the formation of that is to go ahead and save money also. And Martin, can you tell us, therefore, have you modelled the council tax harmonisation approach effectively on a zero increase on council tax? And I appreciate there are 3 different councils, and therefore that would mean a different way of looking at it. But is there a way that you looked at it, which is effectively harmonising it downwards rather than upwards?
Okay, so in response to that, what flows through the financial model at the moment is a 3.99% increase in council tax. We haven't actually done and presented the information on a 0% increase, but we could provide that information quite easily. So we've got a financial model where you can change various assumptions, and if we switch the cell from 3.99 to 0%, it would give us a different range of figures. What it would show, though, interestingly, is that approach 1, taking the average approach, will always generate more council tax income than approach 2, which I'm about to come on to. So as part of this presentation, we've not modelled 0%. Could we model it? Could we do that quite easily? Yes, we could do. And if you're interested, we can provide that information to you.
Thank you, Martin. And through you, Chair, I think it's very important as we represent people, and I'm sure we all have this at the heart of what we do. It's essential that we do model it on 0%. We have that as a model option too, as a genuine option, because I appreciate there is 3.99% being looked at. But to be genuinely sure about this, the unitary argument is all about lowering costs, making a better service, a better system to the people that we serve and represent. We cannot and we must not only have models that increase council tax. And I appreciate the cost of services. Yes, there's COVID-19 implications. All of that is taken on board. But we cannot go and collect it from people who are seriously affected very badly by the implications of what's happened and what's happening over these few months and the forthcoming year. So please, can we, Martin, model that? I appreciate your work involved. That doesn't mean to say we've made a decision either way, but it does mean to say that we have a range of evidence there and of data that we can there take for a decision, a balanced one going forward.
Certainly, and I can provide that information to give you an indication of the impact that will have on the finances. If it was modelled on 0% rather than 3.99%, we would receive about £8 million less in council tax for the provision of services going forward, just to give you an indication.
Sure. Okay. I appreciate that. That's very important. And Madam Chair, I hope we are able to reinforce that message that we don't necessarily support increases, particularly in times of drastic situations that have happened nationally. Thank you.
I absolutely take your point, and I think that is something that can be included in any kind of recommendations. Yeah.
Chair.
Yes.
Taking Andre's point, if we were to look at the screen that we've got in front of us now, if you look at the middle box, which is the 20/21 recast to average, that slide there indicates the percentage increase or decrease per council tax authority based on just moving to the average in 1 year. So Martin, correct me if I'm wrong, but if that's this year, 1491, that's the average, and we have to average in due course. We have to get to a point in due course. But if we took that as being this year, and there was no council tax increase, no increase in the tax take, that would be the impact on each area. So 2.8, negative 1.6, 0.7. If you were to harmonise that over 7 years, you would just be fiddling with those figures, adjusting them up or down, so that at the end of year 7, it was 2.8, negative 1.6, or 0.7. So there's an indication, I think, in front of you of what would happen if we didn't increase council tax rates across the board. We just average them out so that everybody's paying the same across the New West Authority. But by the end of year 8, the council would have lost £56 million of income, and the whole basis of council tax would have been reset, as it were.
Yeah.
Rebecca, sorry.
That's an indication to you of what would happen if we didn't increase council taxes, is that middle box.
Yeah, that's right.
Yes.
Yeah, appreciate clarification. Sorry, Chair. Just to come back on that, and thanks, Rebecca. I appreciate that point. Obviously, it's an averaging as opposed to obviously a zero basing, if you like, or a zero increase, because clearly still Daventry and South Northants would have some sort of increase, whatever that would be. I think there's also, and I'm pragmatic about it as well, and realistic in that situation, that we obviously would not have charged over 8 years £53 million to the residents of our area either. So therefore, I absolutely agree. We wouldn't have had that income, but we certainly would not have charged them as well. So that would still be in the pocket of the residents. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay.
Thank you, Madam Chairman.
Right. Do you want to move on, Martin?
Yep.
And
Okay,
I'm
I
sure
will do.
This will pose more questions for you.
Okay, thank you, Chair. So I'll move on to approach 2. So that was the average approach that we just talked about there. The second approach that can be taken is that the referendum limit isn't applied to the average council tax that's been calculated when you recast it for the current year. It's applied to the individual council tax elements for each of the predecessor areas. It continues to assume that these assumptions are consistent all the way through the financial modelling at the moment, but can be tweaked, as we've just discussed. Continues to assume 3.99% increase in adult social care, so you've got that comparability, and again assumes no increase in tax base between 2021 and 21-22. The figures here are the same, the tax base is the same, the current year's information is the same, the total council tax yield is the same at 207.1 million. If you then looked at increasing the individual areas rather than the average, you don't recast the council tax and apply the threshold, the referendum limit to that recast, that recalculated figure. You apply the referendum limit to each of the individual areas. So if you increased all of them by 3.99%, they would go up to these figures here. But if you keep on doing that, then you never actually are able to harmonise council tax. If you just keep increasing each of the individual areas by 3.99%, you never come together. So what you have to do is effectively apply the referendum limit to the lowest levying council tax area, which in our case is Daventry. You apply 3.99% to that, and you adjust the others to harmonise over a period of time. And again, you have options in terms of the harmonisation period, so you can take up to 7 years to do that, so that by year 8 you're harmonised. So again, this final box here on the right hand side is again for comparability. just giving, making the assumption that harmonisation takes place in year 1. And if that was the case, and you took the individual area approach rather than the average approach, this is what would happen to the council tax amounts that are levied. So the council tax would go up to 1509.48 from vesting day. For Daventry residents, that would be a 3.99% increase. For Northampton residents, it will be a reduction of 0.45%. And for South Northampton residents, it will be an increase of 1.87%, which gives you then, you multiply this figure here, which basically is based on the Daventry council tax level, times the tax base figures here, and that gives you your total tax yield for 21-22. And in total, that gives you almost £210 million. When you compare that to the previous slide was £215 million. So taking the council tax harmonisation approach 2, the individual council tax approach, you're actually worse off by about £6 million if you go for approach 2 over approach 1. So the first decision that needs to be taken is which approach should be taken by the authority. Should approach 1 be taken using the average, or should approach 2 be taken using the individual area approach? Approach 1 generates more council tax income. Approach 2 generates less. So I will pause there, and the next slide then begins to unpack some of those options in terms of if you take a different amount of time to harmonise, what's the effect on the income? So we'll come on to that on the next slide, but I'll pause on this slide because it's important to explain the 2 different approaches, and it's important for members to begin to form a view on which approach should be taken. Should it be the average approach, or should it be the individual area approach that should be taken?
Martin, I have a question. How long would it take to reach harmonisation if you applied this individual council tax approach?
You can still harmonise in year 1 if you wanted to, but you wouldn't harmonise to the same level of council tax as you would in approach 1. So approach 1 will always generate more council tax for you if you take the average approach rather than the individual area approach. In terms of harmonisation period, you can take up to 8 years again for each of the approaches, which is why it's important to consider the approach you're going to take first of all, approach 1 or approach 2, before you have discussions around, or before you determine that harmonisation period, because again there are nuances associated with both of those, which I'll come on to in a few minutes time. Okay,
Alan Walker has a question as well. Alan.
Yeah, just continuing on that theme, Martin, in relation to, I'm fairly well versed in where we're going at the moment. I suppose that, you know, from a scrutiny point of view, the other question Andre's asked about the 0% increase. I suppose from a scrutiny point of view, if I have always been correct, at some stage, I mean, we should be looking, one, normally you increase your council tax to raise enough money to cover your services. So are we saying then, if at the end of this period, this reduction in total council tax income, which is minus 5829, that needs to be harmonised to ensure that we have a balanced budget at year 8 or even at year 1, because each year we have to have a balanced budget. Is that correct? Yes.
Yeah, that's right. So if you take, through you, Chair, if you take approach 2 over approach 1, you're actually automatically bringing in an additional pressure, income pressure of about 5.9 million. So that becomes a further additional pressure which the budget and medium-term financial planning task and finish group will need to consider. And that gives you an indication of the magnitude of that. So that just gives you an extra £5.9 million problem to deal with in terms of funding the budget.
Yeah, okay. I think, because as I say, I think that that's the understanding. At the end of the day, the only reason you're raising council tax is to pay for the services. Obviously not putting in your back pocket or anything like that, and if you don't raise the income tax to the level that you raise the services, you, as you say, you get yourself into trouble, because if you don't do it one year, the next year you're going to have to double it, or whatever the case may be. Is that correct?
Yeah, it has a cumulative impact.
Right, we've got a question from Michael Warren as well, and then Andre again. Michael, do you want to?
Thank you, Chair. Just wondering whether you've actually thought about if you increase the council tax too much over the early years, that you're actually going to force people into the council reduction scheme, because the residents are going to find that increase, what with everything that's been going on through the economy and COVID-19, they're not actually going to be able to afford the council tax. So they're going to have to look for relief. So possibly the additional residents moving into the relief scheme will offset the cost that you're losing from the council tax.
And through you, Chair, that's a really good point. And it's absolutely, there is an absolute link between people who struggle to pay council tax and the amount of council tax we receive. And when we come on to the council tax reduction scheme slides a bit later in this presentation, we can already see that there is an increase in demand for the council tax reduction scheme, because people are struggling a bit at the moment because of the virus outbreak. So there is a link between the two. Absolutely right.
Yes, it's striking that balance. Right, Andre.
Thank you, Chair. We really have to go back to macroeconomics here, because quite clearly we are assuming from all the slides here, and I appreciate, Martin, you've run them obviously on the basis of the information you've been discussing pre this meeting, but we are assuming that there is a council tax increase, and we really should be looking for the savings being brought together with the unitary authority situation. We are referring to an increase on a regular basis here in this conversation, which I have to say I take umbrage to, because the whole matter should be looked at in a far larger sense. I appreciate that these are figures in terms of income figures, but we should be looking at the costs also in terms of delivering services that should be lowered through unitary arrangements. And I really would like to see us discuss the fact that there are so many savings to be made. I mean, that was the original approach, and that was one of the foundations that we were all sold the ideas on. Let's face it. What are the savings? I mean, I have to say, no one's discussed it. And let's be very visible with it. Let's get transparent with the fact that if we are bringing three councils together, there surely have to be savings that we can find within there that therefore will be better and more beneficial to the members of our community and the residents who obviously pay the council tax bill. Nobody should be sold a scenario here where we are selling them a unitary authority and then increasing their council tax. It's a farce. I'm sorry, Madam Chairman. I really do feel that we are being influenced. And Martin's not a personal situation, and Rebecca too. Please understand, these are conversations clearly being had and no decisions have been agreed. But we should be being presented with some alternatives, which are zero base increase here to the council tax. Because of the fact that there will be savings to be found. So therefore there will not be a loss effectively, there will not be a damage to the actual core budget, because the budget will not be required. I mean, I'd like to know how £300 million has been reached. Is that the budget that's really required? And if so, what's that based on? I haven't seen that detail. I would really like to see that in more detail.
And okay, through you, Chair, if I could. I absolutely agree with all of those comments, because this is just part of a big and really difficult jigsaw we're trying to put together in relation to formulating plans for the budget for next year. This is just one element of it. It's a significant element of it. It's an element that this committee showed a particular interest in, which is why we brought it into you separately, to give you a bit of background information and to walk you through the approach on council tax harmonisation, what we have to do, and then CTRS, which we'll come on to. But it is just one element of the overall budget setting process. What will come back to future meetings are those other pieces of pulling that budgetary information together. So this is relating to one element of income. We'll also, this is why the Council Tax Harmonisation Task and Finish Group then reports in and feeds into the Budget and Medium-Term Financial Planning Task and Finish Group, because they will take that macro approach. They will look at the current cost of services. They will look at the overall demand-led increases that are required in the budget. They will look at things like contractual inflation, salary inflation, etc., etc. They will look at the overall demand on services. They will look at the pressures associated with coronavirus and everything associated with that, to build an overall picture in terms of what the costs are showing. And then set against that will be the amount of government grant we're expecting to receive and council tax, which is what we're discussing this evening. So we are deliberately just discussing one element of the overall budget picture. We are also more than happy to come back to this committee, and when we have more information and more detail on the overall budget position, which we can present, which this will be one element of, we'll come back and share that as well. But this was brought first of all because it is something that needs to be considered early on. CTRS, for example, we need to go out to consultation on around about October time, and it was trying to give this committee the opportunity to feed into that right at the start of the process rather than towards the end. So I absolutely agree. The macro position is being developed. We're not there in a position where we can present it to you yet. This is just one element of it. When we have that macro position, we'll bring that back to you and share that information with you too.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Martin. Right, I think there's no more questions on this. Could we move on to the next slide?
Okay, so this slide then is looking at what happens in terms of the total income in relation to the two approaches that are being taken here. So the first 4 lines, which all start referendum limit on average, that shows if you harmonise in year 1 for 2021-22, you will generate about £215 million worth of income. And in actual fact, if you take the average approach, the harmonisation period doesn't make any difference to the overall council tax income that's received. So whether you harmonise in year 1 or whether you harmonise in year 8, the amount of council tax income is the same if you take the average approach. And you can see that that exists, that relationship exists all the way through 22, 23, 23, 24, etc. And you can see that regardless of the number of years to harmonise, if you take the average approach, that total council tax yield is the same for each of those different options. That's not the situation if you harmonise using the individual area approach, which was approach 2. So if you take approach 2 rather than approach 1, and you harmonise in year 1, you generate about £210 million worth of council tax income, as opposed to £215 million using approach 1. If you harmonise over 2 years, actually you generate a bit more income than if you harmonise over 1 year. If you harmonise over 4 years, again, a bit more. And if you harmonise over 8 years, you'll receive £215 million harmonising over 8 years rather than harmonising over just 1 year. This is just a selection of the different options that there are. I think the really important point is, if you go for approach 1, the average approach, that will always generate more income in total. If you go for approach 1, in terms of total income received, the harmonisation period makes no difference to the total income received. But if you go for approach 2, then the harmonisation period does make a difference. If we come to year 8, which is this year here, by whether you take approach 1 or approach 2, you have to have harmonised by year 8, and taking approach 1 would give you a figure of £283 million worth of income, and taking approach 2 would give you a figure of £276 million worth of income. And that demonstrates that taking approach 1 over approach 2 generates in total, by the time you get to year 8, £7.67 million more in council tax income in that financial year. Depending on the options taken under approach 2, because the different harmonisation periods do deliver different amounts of income, the cumulative impact, if you added up the difference between these figures for that year, and then you added to that the difference for the second year, etc. So you took the cumulative approach, the cumulative loss of income over 8 years is much higher, and it ranges between 32 million and 54 million pounds of lost income, depending on the approach taken. So those figures are quite stark. It's a big difference in income, particularly over the cumulative time period. But it gives you an indication of the difference in those income levels depending on the approach that's taken.
Right. And Martin, that is presuming that there's a 3.99 increase each year.
It is. So again, we can and we will rework all these figures with a 0 increase, just to give you an indication. What it will show is the total council tax yield, which is what these figures are, will be lower, but it will show that the approach 1, so harmonising on the average council tax, will always generate more council tax income than if you take the individual area approach.
Okay. Right. I don't think there's any questions on that.
Okay. I think I've covered most of those points in terms of presenting the slides. So I don't think there's anything to add in relation to that. So I'll move on. These conclusions are self-evident, really. Council tax income crucial to the financial viability of the new authority. Income is maximised by applying the referendum limit to the average rather than to the individual areas, so approach 1 rather than approach 2. as I've just kind of laboured, if you take the average option, the total income yield is the same regardless of the harmonisation period that's applied. And then you've got this just what the total council tax income would be. And again, I've set out some of those on the previous slides. So I don't think I need to labour that last point. It's repeating the point I made earlier, I think, on the previous slide.
Thank you. Yeah.
So I will pause there because, Chair, I think when you introduced this session, I think you said that was the most straightforward one, the council tax harmonisation one. So I will pause there before we move on to council tax reduction scheme, see if there's any more questions, and then we'll move on to the local council tax reduction scheme.
Right, I don't see anybody else wanting to answer a question right now. Rebecca, are you happy to give us some background on the council tax reduction scheme, which obviously has a huge bearing on whether the annual increase in council tax is needed and the effects that would have on people needing to use the council tax reduction scheme?
Absolutely, and we are particularly mindful of that because, of course, it affects our most vulnerable residents right across the West. So at the moment, the three authorities operate very different council tax reduction schemes, ranging from 8.5% in South Northants, 20% in Daventry, and 35, depending on how you calculate it, in the borough. And so in real terms, this means that if you are for example, somebody on universal credit getting the support allowance of about £407 a month, you will be paying in South Northants with our 8% scheme £125 a year of your total council tax bill. So that's 8.5%. In Daventry, you'd be paying £290 a year. In the borough, you'd be paying £470 a year. So that's £2.40 a week, £5.50 a week, or £9 a week in the borough. This has to be harmonised, and at the moment, it appears it has to be harmonised by the time we go into unitary. There is some indication that there may be a bit of leeway for 2 years, but that's not clear at the moment. So at the moment, we're working on the presumption that these schemes have to be harmonised across the West by vesting day. And so if you're a resident of South Northampton, at the moment you're paying £2.40, you are the most vulnerable, you're paying £2.40, you're going to be looking at a potentially substantial increase, and that is going to really affect South Northampton residents. So what we as a Task and Finish group, we've been really mindful of the dramatic impacts that this has on our most vulnerable residents. And we asked Belinda Green to work up some case studies so that we could understand on an individual's budget, if you were a single person looking for work, if you are a pensioner couple, various scenarios, so that we could understand the impact. Because what we have to do is look across the authority, bearing in mind also that any reduction we give to working age adults, we can't recover from central government. It's a direct hit on the budget for the West Authority. So, of course, we've got COVID and numbers have been creeping up across the three authorities. So that in itself is going to have an increase, an effect on the total budget. So there's a lot to factor in. It is possibly even more complicated than the subject we've just been discussing. So what we've been looking at is the impact of various scenarios on the budget of the West and on the budgets of our residents, because it has such a profound impact. So I'll pass to Martin now to give you the slides that he's just done, and I'll come back after he's done his piece. And I think Belinda will also be contributing.
Thank you. Thank you. Right.
Okay. Thank you, Chair.
Martin.
Thank you. So it's just been, has been set out. I think it's worthwhile just giving a bit of context. So what is the local council tax reduction scheme? Lots of acronyms here. It's referred to sometimes as council tax reduction, local council tax reduction, or council tax reduction scheme, they all mean the same thing. We call it, we're trying to make sure we're consistent in our description, we call the local council tax reduction scheme, so LCTRS. Up until 2013, people could apply for council tax benefit, and that was scrapped in 2013, and it was replaced with the discretion for local authorities to design their own level of support for working age claimants primarily, to receive assistance in terms of paying the council tax bill. And so therefore, because there was local discretion, there will be variety across all the different local authorities, and certainly across West Northamptonshire there are differences, as Councillor Breese has just set out. It's important to highlight that the scheme is prescribed for pensioner claimants, which means that they can claim up to 100% relief, but it is means tested. They won't not every pensioner will get 100% relief because it's means tested, but they can claim up to 100% relief. But that doesn't apply to working age claimants, which is where the local discretion comes in. As has been set out, there are differences between the different schemes across West Northamptonshire at the moment. So Daventry have a 20% scheme, which means that those claimants have to pay at least 20% of their council tax bill. Northampton have a 35/31% scheme, which I'll come back to in a minute, which means they have to pay at least 35% of their council tax bill. South Northampton have a scheme which means working age claimants have to pay at least 8.5% of their council tax bill. And the next bullet point just points out, therefore, that in Daventry's situation, the claimant will be responsible for at least 20% of the bill, and therefore the council will fund a maximum of 80% of the bill. There are two ways of calculating those percentages that I refer to. Neither are incorrect, but there have been differences in terms of how they've been calculated across West Northamptonshire historically. So if we apply consistency to that, where Northampton at the moment will talk about a 35% scheme, if we calculate, if we carry out a consistent calculation, we'd recalculate that figure, and that would be a 31% scheme rather than 35%. And so we've done the financial modelling based on that consistency across that consistent calculation method across the three different areas. So going forward, I'll be referring to a 31% scheme, because then we're comparing like with like. And that's what that final bullet point talks about there. Important to say that the financial modelling is carried out at a point in time. It's based on the current council tax levels, 2020, 2021. It's changing, it almost changed on a daily basis. And we have seen an increase in demand over the last month or two, and that will have an impact on the overall costs of the current schemes that are in operation. And it's really important to highlight at this early stage that any decision on the local council tax reduction scheme will have an impact on the tax base, because essentially it's a discount that we're offering to council tax, and therefore discounts actually work their way through the overall tax base calculation. Now that's important to highlight, because it means it will have an impact on town councils, parish councils, and the police and fire commissioner. So it's worth highlighting that whatever decisions are taken on LCTRS, it does flow through and have an impact on the council tax base, and so therefore we need to be consulting with town and parish councils and police and fire. I think probably the best way to describe the overall scheme is if we look at the total cost of the current scheme in the constituent areas. And if we decide to provide more support to residents across West Northamptonshire, so we move towards the South Northampton scheme, the 8.5% scheme, put simply, that will cost more money. That will have a cost impact. If there was a decision taken to actually move towards giving less support, so moving towards a Northampton scheme, something similar to the Northampton scheme at the moment, that would actually save money going forward, because there wouldn't be as much financial support that's given by West Northamptonshire going forward. And so there is, again, quite a detailed financial model that underpins all of this, but essentially it's really quite simply, in one respect, it's a sliding scale. So the more support you give to residents who are struggling to pay their council tax bill, the more it will cost. The less support you give, there will be savings coming out of that. And this is what that slide is trying to show. So the cells that are in blue at the top, the cost of the current scheme, that shows the total cost of the current scheme using a 20% scheme in Daventry, a 31% scheme in Northampton, 8.5% scheme in South Northampton, and the total cost of that is about £9 million. If complete and full support was given to working age claimants, so they could claim up to 100% relief for their council tax bill, based on the figures at the time of putting these numbers together, and there has been an increase in demand, which I'll come on to in a minute, that actually would cost a further 3.8 million. If the decision was taken to move towards a 8.5% scheme, so one similar to South Northants or the same as South Northants at the moment, that would cost about 2.5 million. If there was a decision taken to move towards a scheme that was similar to Daventry's, that would cost almost £1 million compared to the current cost of the scheme. We also calculated what a break-even scheme would be. So if you took the cost of the current schemes, that 9.2 million, and you compared that to what local council tax reduction scheme model you would bring in going forward, and you didn't want it to cost more money, and you didn't want to bring more, you didn't want it to cost less money, you wanted to have a cost neutral position. That cost neutral position, based at the time putting these figures together, was about a 26.5% scheme you would bring in. You'd have a harmonised scheme at 26.5%. If you move to a 31% scheme, there'd be a cost saving of about 648,000. And if you move to a 35% scheme, there'd be a cost saving of 1.2 million. The key point being, I think kind of illustrated better on this slide, is that the greater the amount of support you give, i.e. where working age claimants can claim up to 100%, so don't pay any of their council tax bill, the greater the cost is. And there is a sliding scale there. So the more support you give, the more support you give, the more it will cost, and the less support that's given, there could be cost savings going forward. This next slide then talks about what we've seen in the levels of demand since February. So you've got the figures there which show the working age caseload in February 2020 being 11,589 claimants. And then if you follow that line across, you can see that in March 2020, that increased to 11,714, and then to 12,100 almost, and then up to 12,800. And in June, that was just over 13,000. So the caseload is going up, and that's not surprising given everything that's going on. We can calculate what the average cost per additional case is, and we've calculated that to be about £833. So if you simply take this figure here, the increase between February 11,589 and June of 13,073, and you times it by that 800 and multiply it by that £833, you can get an indicative additional cost and therefore a cost pressure, and therefore a budget pressure, and going back to the point that was made earlier, and therefore something that needs to filter into the budget and medium-term financial planning task and finish groups be considered amongst everything else. There'll be an additional cost pressure there of £1.2 million, just based on the demand increase that we've seen between February and June. And that's altering all the time, but we will continually update this and take this kind of information into the budget medium-term financial planning group for them to consider alongside all of the other elements of the budget formulation that they're considering. So I'll pause there, Chair, if you're okay with that, because the next 4 slides are case studies, so you can see the impact on individuals, and I'll ask Belinda Green to take you through those, because she's produced those slides and she knows the detail a lot better than I do. So I'll pause there for questions at this point, and if there aren't any, then I'll pass over to Belinda.
Right. Well, I have a question at this point, Martin, because there are people that are exempt from council tax at the moment. Our students don't pay council tax. Northampton has a large number of students, and there are also the young people that are the care leavers who do pay council tax. I mean, do we have any indication as to how they are affected at the moment? Because the figures of working age caseload are rising. Would that include some of these people who perhaps we ought to look at as well, because they're going to be suffering from the financial effects of COVID as much as anybody else, especially groups like the care leavers, who we all have a corporate parental responsibility for as we move into the unitary authority. and they are very, very vulnerable. How much difference would it make if they were added to the say the pension age caseload?
Okay, so through you, Chair, these figures don't include care leavers, for example. That would be a separate consideration. So if there was, I guess, a requirement to consider further support for care leavers, we would need to go away and do a little bit of financial modelling on that. So we would bring back figures and say, for care leavers, this is what we get in council tax, and therefore, if you brought in a care leaver scheme, this is what we estimate it would cost. You can bring in care leaver schemes. I'm aware of care leaver schemes in different counties, across different counties. So there are such schemes in place. It will cost money. So all of this inevitably leads to budget pressure. So it's something that could be looked at. It would generate a further additional budget pressure, but again, it would be considered within the budget and medium-term financial planning task and finish group, again alongside all of the other pressures that are being considered within that group.
Right. Right. I mean, obviously, there's an element of prevention here. The prevention would lead to a lower cost further on. A high proportion of young people that are involved in the the criminal justice system do come from the care leaver sector, because they do get into an enormous amount of financial difficulty once they start living independently post 18. And we are responsible for them until their age of 25. So it's something that I think we ought to maybe factor into the cost, and bearing in mind the eventual potential reduction in costs further down the line. I think, from my point of view, I would think that it would be worth looking at. Ken, you have a question here.
Thank you, Chair. I don't know whether this is appropriate at this time, Martin, but how does the single occupancy and the reduction in council tax relate to single occupancy?
So that's a slightly different consideration, because that's more to do with discounts and exemptions, which are separate from local council tax reduction scheme. So running alongside all of this, and there are many kind of elements to it. Running alongside all of this as well are discounts and exemptions that are offered, which would include second homes discounts, for example, which would include single person discounts, which would include a whole range of different discounts, which again form part of the overall consideration that goes into the budget group, but also goes into the tax-based calculation as well. So that's where that features.
Thank you very much for that, Martin. Thank you.
Okay.
Right. Martin, is there any indication as to the number of people that default on their council tax? And what are those rates of collections across the districts and boroughs?
We do have all of that information. I don't have it to hand right here and now, but I could certainly circulate that information to committee members. It does vary across the districts and boroughs, as I think you'd probably expect. And I can certainly circulate that information to you.
Because that'll have an effect. Ken Pritchard, I think you're indicating you'd have a question. I think Ken's phoning in.
I've just taken my hand down.
Yeah. Oh.
Okay.
Right. And I can't see any more questions. Would you like to?
Okay, so thank you, Chair. If I just move on then, and if I ask Belinda Green to go through the next 4 slides, because these talk about 4 different case studies, so you can see what the impact on an individual will be based on the different options that there are. So over to you, Belinda, if you're okay with that, Chair.
Thank you, Martin. Thank you, Chair. Yes, as Martin said, we've got some case studies to go through with you this evening. And I think Martin did touch on in his presentation earlier that local council tax reduction is means tested. So it is very much based on a needs allowance compared to the income of a particular household. So just to give you a little bit of background on example 1, Mr. A is a single working age local council tax reduction claimant who lives in the South Northampton area, and that was just by purpose of example to talk you through the different impacts of the different changes in liability. lives in a Band C property with council tax liability of £1,685 a year. And in this case, because he lives alone, he gets a single person discount. So that comes off of his council tax liability as well. So his total liability for the year, 1,264 or £24.25 a week. So that's the starting point for any calculation for council tax reduction. The next thing really is to consider what the income is of that household compared to the needs allowance that they're judged to have. So Mr. A has income of £74.25, just employment and support allowance, income based. So that's effectively for anybody who remembers passported benefits. So it's similar to income support in the way that it's classed. So that gives entitlement to maximum council tax reduction. So you can see in the table below that the scheme, if we look at the 8.5% reduction, which is currently in place at South Northamptonshire, it shows you the weekly council tax award, the council tax reduction award of 22, and how much is to be paid. So that's effectively £2 a week. And then it converts to the annual award as well, and the annual amount to pay. So as we work through the table, you can see the difference then between the 8.5%, which is the most favourable we've got across the West at the moment, and it shows you the impact on the individual households of the various changes that we could consider. So the second one down is the 20%, which is currently in operation in Daventry. So that would show an award of £19.40 a week. So it would increase the amount to pay for this particular customer to £4.85. And the final column shows you there the difference between the 20% and the 8.5%. So that would mean an additional £2.78 for Mr. A to find from his £74.25 income a week. So he'd have to pay council tax of £4.85 a week from his £74. And then as we go through 26.5, which as Martin discussed earlier on, is the break-even point for this. So if we wanted to have a scheme that was either costing us more or bringing more money in, that would actually mean that our customer in this example would have to pay £6.43 a week. So an additional £4.36 from his income, which is, as I say, is £74 a week. And that moves to the 31% liability, which is currently what the borough have in place. And as you can see, that means he'd have to pay £7.52 a week. And that's an additional £5.45 to pay. So it's almost, that takes his income from £74.25 down to below £70 a week available income for the rest of his living expenses. And then there's working it out on the 35% as well. But as Martin touched on earlier on, that just demonstrates the different ways in which you can calculate council tax reduction. And for the purposes, what we've done is made sure that it's all the same. So comparing like to like, so that 31% is the liability that Northampton Borough have at the moment. So case study 2 is again a single working age customer who lives in the South Northampton area, again Band C property, just so that we can demonstrate to you in the examples a similar thread. She's got council tax liability again of 1,685 and a single person discount, so that's taken off before we even start any calculations for council tax reduction, local council tax reduction. This lady's working and earning, and she also receives universal credit as well as a top up of her weekly income. So she has a needs allowance, which is laid out by the government, of 184.54. So when you add the income that she has from wages and a universal credit, she's actually judged to have excess income of £41. So that's available income above the needs allowance that she has. And again, the table below just works out, for example, if it was an 8.5% scheme that we used, it shows you that she would be required to pay £10.36 towards council tax herself. And then moving to the 20%, you can see that increases to £13.14, so an extra £2.78. The break-even point there increases it again to £14.72, so effectively another £4.36 above the 8.5% would have to be paid. and 31 would actually cost would mean she'd have to pay an extra £5.45. So you can see those figures as you can increasing from £10 to pay under 8.5% through to £15 a week to pay on the 31% scheme. The third example, a working age couple with 2 children, again in a Band C property, to get that consistent approach for us. No single person discount because there's two adults living in the property, so their council tax liability is £32.33 a week. And it summarises the income for you there. So child benefit is in payment. This is actually disregarded income, so it's not taken into account for the council tax reduction schemes. Universal credit is also in payment. And the family also receive personal independence payments, as you can see. So they've got some additional needs on the daily living component, and they also receive a monthly component for mobility, both which are disregarded as income when you're looking at their income each week. So they have a needs allowance of £491, and they have an excess income figure of £54.52 a week. And again, the table below just really shows again, if we had an 8.5% scheme, then Mr. and Mrs. S would be required to pay £13.66 towards the council tax themselves. That would rise to £17.34, so an additional £3.71 a week under a 20% scheme. The break-even scheme, the point would mean payment of £19.47. So an additional £5.81 a week for the family to find out of their total income. And that rises again to £20.93 a week under a 31% scheme. So an additional £7. So I think the examples show the impact of moving from an 8.5% through to, the higher end of the scale at the 31% liability. And the last example really is really to just demonstrate the pensioner side of this, because I think Martin touched on a lot of the considerations we've got to make are around the working age, because we have to follow the default regs for the regulations for the pension schemes. That's the regulations laid down for us by the government. So Mr. and Mrs. T are pension age, living in, again, a Band C property. No sort of single person discount because there's 2 adults in the property. They have income of £314, which is made up of state benefits and 2 private pensions. And they also have a small amount of capital as well of 13,000. So again, we'd work exactly the same way. So they'd have a means test, that the needs allowance is £280. So they too have an excess income figure. So they're not entitled to full council tax reduction. So you can see there how much they'd have to pay. And that's just really to demonstrate the point that, the default scheme is there for pensioners, but not all pensioners get the 100% help with their council tax. It still is dependent on that means test. I'm happy to take any questions, Chair, that might come out of the examples.
Right, I can't see any questions for the moment. Ken Ritchie. Ken, would you like to ask your question?
Thank you. I mean, all the examples that have been given assume that the people you're talking about are going to get the full reduction under the council tax reduction scheme. And notes there are other criteria, are there not, that come into deciding what level of reduction someone might get. So that even if you went for the 8.5 that is used in South Northants, am I right in saying that should not necessarily mean that every claimant in South Northants would necessarily get that that level of support?
Yeah, absolutely.
And how do you then factor all that in to your calculations?
Yeah. Through you, Chair. Yeah, that's absolutely right. So, for example, if someone was on a passported benefit, so income support, for example, in South Northamptonshire at the moment, and they were working age, they would get 91.5% of their council tax paid by the local council tax reduction scheme, they would still have to find that 8.5%. The examples we gave are people who are not on maximum benefit, so they've got what we call an excess income figure. So say, for example, they've got more income that the government than we feel they need to live on, their maximum council tax reduction is reduced by 20% of that excess income figure. So those examples actually show people who are not necessarily on a maximum amount. So you're absolutely right, there is that sliding scale depending on the means test that we attribute to the council tax reduction scheme.
Oh, Julie Davenport. Julie, would you like to ask your question?
Yeah, I'm quite shocked actually about what's happening to claimants in Northampton, especially example one. They pay £7 or £8 a week, and they're only earning £74. But the question is, will this be explained to us, like we asked about council tax in the very beginning? Will this be explained to us as to why these decisions were made? Because I truly wasn't aware that there was such disparity until I read this.
Yeah, I mean, I think through you, Chair, I think it takes us back to the point that Martin was saying about council tax in general, that the decisions that have been made since council tax benefit was replaced by local council tax schemes back in 2013, these schemes have evolved because everybody's local scheme is very different. So, you know, that's in the borough, they would have made that decision based on, I'm guessing, their financial picture at that point. And, you know, the schemes have evolved, and across the country, everybody's scheme is very, very different.
Do you have any more questions? I can't see any. Martin, Belinda, can I just ask if there's a way that you could calculate or forecast the number of people that would be eligible for this council tax reduction scheme with the different levels of council tax harmonisation that have been presented this evening? Because as Andre, I think it was Michael saying earlier on, that, you know, one could cause a problem or cause an increase in the other, which actually at the end of the day would not be beneficial.
Through you, Chair, yes, we would be able to do that. I think I'm just going to flick back to this slide here. So this shows what would happen if we move to the different schemes that are currently in place across West Northamptonshire, and gives you an indication based on the caseload and the cost of what the overall financial impact would be. There is that link between council tax collection rates and local council tax reduction scheme, and the level of support you currently give, and what that means to the overall collection rates. And in actual fact, that information has been requested by the Budget and Medium Term Financial Planning Task and Finish Group, because they've made exactly the same link, and they've said, well, actually, if you have a more generous scheme, although it costs more money, you could well collect more council tax, and therefore that could increase the overall council tax yield that you receive. What we're trying to do is, at this point in time, look at the different cohorts of council taxpayer and get information on that, so we can have a look at that financial modelling and say, well, if you change the council tax reduction scheme down to this level or up to this level, this is what we think it might do to the overall council tax collection rates, and see if one trades off against the other and see what that relationship is like. That's been requested already, where we're trying to, or we're getting to the position where we're pulling out that information, and that'll be part of the further considerations going forward.
Thank you. And I think particularly thinking about the comments that Andre was making earlier about, you know, why do we always just presume that there's going to be the 3.99% increase? You know, how many more people would be pushed into becoming eligible for the local, you know, the council tax reduction scheme, and therefore a loss of income or a cost to the new authority? You know, I think that's probably another way of looking at this, to see what the eventual cost to the authority might be.
Yes, I agree, Chair.
Yeah, okay, thank you. Right.
Okay, there was just a couple more slides, Chair, that I was just going to take you through. One was just setting out what the consultation requirements are in relation to the local council tax reduction scheme. The scheme has to be in place by the 31st of January. We have to consult with any major precepting authority and any persons who are likely to have an interest. It's got to be meaningful. It's got to be meaningful consultation for a reasonable period of time. So we're suggesting at least 6 weeks consultation process. And therefore we would expect consultation on the scheme, which hasn't been determined yet, to start in October. And then we would have a look at the outcome from that consultation, and then there will be a council decision, a shadow council decision in relation to what the CTRS scheme going forward would be from the 1st of April next year. Councillor Breeze touched on how much time we have to bring in a local council tax reduction scheme. The regulations say where practicable, it should be in by vesting day. But there is a little bit of, I guess, leeway in that respect in terms of whether it is practicable or not. I would say, sitting here now, I feel that it is practicable to have in by the 1st of April next year. So, and that's the point that Councillor Breeze was referring to earlier. So that's consultation, and then finally, just a summary on LCTRS. We think at this point in time that we have to have it harmonised by 1st of April 21, which is the point I've just made. Based on the information at the time of pulling these slides and this financial modelling together, the cost neutral scheme was actually a 26.5% scheme, which means there will be no additional cost pressures in relation to that. And as I've said before, a higher scheme would reduce costs and a lower scheme would be a cost pressure. So that's just emphasising that point. And that's the end of the presentation, Chair. So I'll stop sharing my screen now and see if there's any more questions from anybody.
Thank you. Oh. Right, do we have any more questions? Rebecca, is there anything you'd like to add to that? Because obviously there's been a huge amount of discussion around this already. And
I hope you got from the slides and the questions that we've asked of officers, case studies, that we are very mindful of the impact of any decision we make, both in terms of our residents and in terms of the wider budget. It's not by any means an easy decision to make on either of those subject areas. So it's just part of a bigger picture that we have to factor in preparing a budget. And I hope that the Scrutiny Committee will be mindful of the gravity that we see in our decision-making process and the impacts that it has. Just one small point I'd make on the LCTRS and perhaps the emphasis on the impact on South North Hants and also Daventry compared to the borough. And we're also aware that it appears that perhaps our residents have had it good. They're only paying 8.5% or 20%, and in the borough they have been paying more of their council tax. But there is a quirk in the DWP, in that if you are a resident of South North Hants and Daventry, you have to attend your local job centre plus, and that's in Northampton. So if you're a South North Hants resident or a Daventry resident, you have to pay for a bus fare to go in, if you're a job seeker or with the job coach, every 2 weeks to see your job coach or to sign on. In the main, that's not recoverable. And if you live in South North Hants, that's £10 you have to find out of your meagre benefits to pay the bus fare to go in. Otherwise, you get sanctioned. We, of course, live close to Banbury, and there's a job centre plus in Banbury, but our residents in South North Hants are not allowed to go to Banbury, despite regular entreaties that it would be time saving, cost saving. They have to go to Northampton. So that's like an extra tax that our residents have to bear. So it all balances out. So whether you live in the borough or in South North Hants, it does have an impact.
Right. Thank you. Any questions from anybody? Right. Ken, you've got a question there.
Yes, I mean, it's more a comment than a question. I just think what Rebecca has said strikes me as being very, very important, and it possibly applies to issues of council tax too across the area. People in different parts are going to have very different costs, and I'm just hoping that in some way that can be recognised. When we're trying to achieve a situation in which everybody is treated equally. Everybody is not the same, don't have the same circumstances. And I just, you can't actually design a scheme around about each individual. But how is this being tackled? I've been listening to the extent to which the problem is being recognised.
Rebecca, have you got?
In terms of how the problem is being tackled, in as much as the information we have available to now, we are looking at as many scenarios as we can. But given that we only have limited information at the moment as to what's going into the budget, so we don't know what the central government grant is going to be. We don't know what the income streams are going to be. We don't know what the COVID outcome is going to be. So you're seeing headline rates like the 3.99%, which is the budget which is the referendum limit. We have to model against something. We can't just go on. We can't just be sort of amorphous and what if we have to pick some scenarios against which to work and against which to develop case studies, and that I think is what we are doing so that we can address Ken's issues. You have to have a reference point against which to make decisions, and we've got those reference points, but we are so cognizant of the background that applies to the demographics of Northamptonshire, and particularly the West. And there are very different demographics. But I do believe that the Task and Finish group is aware of that. Our officers are aware of that. And so it's working against that background. And we do have to make recommendations, but we need reference points against which to make the recommendations. And ultimately, it will be the new authority who will come up with policies that reflect the outcome at that time. But for now, going into unitary, we're making the best decisions I think that we can, given the information to hand, our understanding of our areas. And of course, the Task and Finish group is made up of representatives of each area and an independent member. And it's a really constructive forum. Information is being fed into us all the time. And I hope that gives you some comfort that we are looking at all sorts of options and considering all sorts of situations.
Right. And do I understand that your initial report has been published today?
Martin?
Yes, that's right. It's being published today. The initial report is going on to the Shadow Executive,
right.
And that was published today.
Thank you. Thank you. What is the general feeling of the committee? I think there's been a number of really important points raised this evening. Is this something that you would wish to look at further? I think there's been discussions and suggestions about a smaller group being formed to look at the finance, and I think this would be a very good place to start. Now, Jamie, who is the Deputy Chair, has experience of the subcommittee system at the borough. And I was wondering, Jamie, would you like to just outline some of the ways that this could work in terms of a smaller subgroup working on this, so that people that are particularly interested in this area could join that group and do some further work based on what we've heard tonight, and perhaps some of the points that have been raised. Jamie, would you like to just
Thank you. It all depends.
We don't have a picture of you, Jamie.
No, I've got very bad connection, Jane. I've been booted out twice already this evening. If I put my camera on, it weakens my signal or something, so I get booted out. So that's why you can't see. But
Okay.
I am. How the working groups work on the borough is from the work programme event, and we held ours last month. We normally come with 2 or 3 subjects that we want to look at more in depth, and then spend some time getting evidence from witnesses, getting other councillors who aren't normally involved in scrutiny or the task and finish groups as they are, to get involved and give their thoughts and feelings if they've got experts in that sort of subject matter. With reports that come like tonight's report, if the committee felt they wanted to do some further investigation, then we could set up another working group. If the committee felt that if tonight's report didn't answer all the questions they had, then we could set up another working group to investigate it further, if that makes sense. But if the committee's happy with tonight's report, then that's it, really.
Well, what is the general feeling from people? Oh, Alan. Alan, do you want to ask?
I also have experience of working groups, working on the county council, but I think in the instance we are at the moment, we're dealing with a shadow group, and we're also dealing with to me, which is a group that has been set up basically to do what we're doing, and that's what Rebecca's the group that's on. So to scrutinise somebody who's scrutinising somebody else, I'm sorry, I think that's probably going overboard. There's enough of us on this committee that understand, and as you can see tonight, lots of people are asking the right questions and we're getting the right answers. We're also getting officer feedback in respect of that which they do have not been asked before. We are asking as a scrutiny committee. So I don't specifically see that we need to set up another task force or a small task force to ask the same questions over and over again. That's my own opinion. Personally, I think we've had a very good presentation tonight. I think the analysis is absolutely brilliant. It's like everything else. You either understand finance, you understand harmonisation, you understand council tax. If you don't understand it, then it's going to be a challenge. But as far as I'm concerned, I think the presentation tonight has been absolutely excellent. And the number of questions that have been asked, and it satisfied me with the questions I've asked, and Andre has asked a couple of questions. The officers are going to come back to us for that. And then again, as I say, we will only be able to analyse that and say whether it's good, bad or indifferent to the governing body or the body that will actually make the decision. So to set up another small group, I don't think is necessary. That's my opinion.
Okay. Ken, you have a comment to make.
I'm not sure if I have a view on whether a small group is necessary, but I'm not sure that I entirely agree with what we've heard. I mean, I very much welcome the presentations. I think that they have been clear. But to me, it doesn't leave me clear about what a sensible course of action should be. I would certainly feel that we should be pushing to ask those who are putting the budget together to make sure that we do not have an approach that would result in anybody needing to pay more than the 3.99%. Is it 3.99, 4.99%? The referendum limit, anyway. I just think to ask people, to pay more than that, I just think that would be unreasonable. But, we all want people to be able to pay the least amount of tax that is possible. We want to be able to help as many people as we possibly can through the council tax reduction scheme. But at the same time, we're in the real world. We know that a budget has got to be put together. But where I have a difficulty when it comes to talking budgets, I think that the two approaches to harmonisation, they produce a difference of, what was it, about 7 to 8 million? Whether or not that is important depends on what that means in terms of the services that are going to be delivered. And I would like this to push the group that is the groups that's working on these issues to come back and explain what different budget figures would actually mean for people's services. Because otherwise, you know, I've got no basis for saying, you know, is it good that we can have an extra 7 million, or we don't need that 7 million, unless we know what it actually means. And it's all very well saying that, look, yeah, you need to be able to understand the figures and everything else. You also need to understand what a budget means in practical terms. And that's the bit that's not at all clear to me.
Right. Now, there's a number of other questions, and I realise that we're well over time, but I think it's important if we can be brief with the questions or the comments, and then we have George do if he's still happy to do that, to look at the executive forward plan briefly. Dermot, you have a question or a comment.
Yeah, I'd just like to say that I support what Alan Walker says 100%. And I won't say more than that in that respect. However, we are the Overview and Scrutiny Committee. And as I understand, it's not our duty to decide what decision is taken on the options that are being put forward by the Task and Finish group. They have put together a most excellent and in-depth coverage of this, which I think we should thoroughly applaud. And look forward. The budget setting again is not in our remit. We're just looking at the realistic figures at the moment. What comes in the future is in the future, but it gives us, it's indicative of the effect this will have both on our budget and on individuals who are in needy circumstances. So, you know, I think we know so far with this we've seen what they're doing, and I wholeheartedly agree with it. I think we should move on to something else at the moment, unless we need to come back to it for any special reason, and I don't see a reason at this moment. Thank you.
Right. Thank you. Dennis, do you have a comment or question?
Thank you, Chair. I have a comment actually. We, as an Overview and Scrutiny group, we've had an excellent, as Councillor Walker has said, an excellent presentation. It's made lots of things very clear and precise, and I think as what we've looked at tonight is to make sure that we are fully abreast of what is happening, and I think that is the main thing which we've achieved tonight. We've had that presentation, which I'm sure if anybody's looking in would have laid a fear. I just have one fear, Chair, is about the 3.99. This could put a lot of people into poverty, this amount, which would go up. And I think what we as a committee, we ought to be having a look at that and commenting on it and putting in recommendations. There's no need for us to set up another group because you're just going round in a circle. I just wanted to make them points to you, so we're aware in the future that we, as an Overview and Scrutiny group, we can always look at what is happening and come back to it. Thanks.
Right. Thank you, Dennis. Andre.
Thank you, Madam Chairman. I think certainly reiterating the points that we've all had a good look at it in terms of the presentation tonight. I think Martin's done an excellent job in terms of giving us the facts and the figures, obviously behind the modelling, which is very important for us all to consider. It is absolutely something that clearly we all want to know more about in terms of that, but it comes back to the baseline budget. What is the budget? And obviously we may not set the budget, but collectively as councillors, obviously we all have an input into that. And we absolutely have to be sharp about what those services are that will be provided and at what cost. Clearly, and I welcome absolutely officers' input there in terms of costs, in terms of cost savings, and in terms of the reorganisation, because that's clearly a prime principle but there has to be a modelling that says 0% increase to the residents of the area that we are covering. It has to be a serious factor that is considered very carefully. In 2.3, I'd absolutely endorse that we shouldn't set up a further group, because I think we want to all be aware of what the decisions are and on what basis those decisions have been made. I think this is really quite important. So, Madam Chairman, I think it's really important that we don't create additional burden to democratic services or anyone else in terms of time, in terms of cost, etc. I appreciate Jamie Lane's excellent experience. I think that should be used definitely going forward in other areas. But I certainly think that we should all be well versed on the decisions that have been taken in terms of budget setting, and then identify the fact that costs clearly should be saved. I'd like to see where those costs are saved. I know there are some very senior officers who've got some excellent plans, and those should come forward as to advise us, as well as obviously the public's views taken on consultation there, and not solely a 3.99% increase, which I feel very strongly about. We should be delivering savings and not increases. And certainly I appreciate, Madam Chairman, the time this evening has gone on, but I think it's an important discussion that we've all had.
Yeah, okay, thank you very much. Julie, comment, question from you? Julie, you're still... Have we lost Julie? Right.
She has disconnected from the meeting, Chair.
Ah, right.
Chair, Councillor Pritchard is raising his hand.
Right, sorry, yes, Ken.
Thank you very much, Chair. I think the presentation given by Martin was very informative, and certainly is.
Oops. Ken, you seem to have lost your sound. Ken, you still have problems with your sound?
Unfortunately, from the telephone.
Ken, are you able to unmute yourself?
Yes,
Right,
can you hear me now?
Yes,
Yes,
indeed.
sorry. It's the presentation given by Martin, I think, was very informative and certainly cleared up quite a few issues that I probably had. One of the things I think that we have to look at is that, of course, that it's incredibly important to actually save money, and also, but it's even more important because the situation we do find ourselves in, we must actually produce a balanced budget. And I think that's incredibly important. And I know sometimes that increases are not acceptable and certainly not very palatable. But at the same token, to ensure that we do actually achieve a balanced budget, I think it must be, there's got to be some certain increases in certain areas. That's a view I have anyway. Over to you, Chair.
Thank you, Ken. Right, Julie, sorry, you're back again. If you'd like to make your comment.
Yes, can you hear me now?
Yes.
Okay. Now, I wanted to say, I mean, I agree with Andre that we don't obviously want any increase, but, you know, in the perfect world, etc. And like I said, I'm shocked at how much people in Northampton are paying. What I've said previously is that I would like to understand all of the savings made so far, you know, on the finance scrutiny for NCC, we were told this was after the commissioners. We were told there were going to be all these savings, whether it be procurement or children's or adults, and I think going forward, it would just be nice to have it on a sheet of paper as to how much they did save compared to what they said, and how much that means we might be able to save more in the future, and then hopefully that will help with the total budget.
Right. I don't think there's any more questions or comments. Martin, there are a number of issues that have been raised, a number of questions asked. Do you think that you could perhaps provide some of those responses at the next meeting? And I mean, maybe a suggestion would be to start looking at the medium-term financial plan. You know, I'd be guided by you on this if you think that's an appropriate next step.
Yeah, thank you, Chair. And I think all those points are really valid. We brought this presentation tonight because members of this committee wanted more information on council tax harmonisation specifically, and council tax reduction schemes specifically. And so that's why we brought that specific information, because they are two big elements of putting the budget together. I absolutely agree, they are just two elements though. So what you then need to see once you understand those two schemes and the harmonisation of council tax and CTRS is how that features within the overall macro position as it was described earlier. So what's the current starting position on the budget and the medium-term financial plan? How does this factor into it? What's the overall deficit or surplus based on the information we've got at this point in time, so that you can take a more reasoned view, I guess, in terms of what your view as a committee would be in relation to that, because at the moment you've got information on those two parts of it, but it's not in the context of how does that fit with the overall budgetary position. So I would suggest what we do is that when we get a bit more information going into the budget and medium-term financial planning task and finish group, so we have a starting position on the budget, we bring that information back into this committee so you can see that overall context of this is what the budget position is shown as at this point in time. You remember that we talked about CTRS and council tax harmonisation. These two lines here, but these are all the other pressures and savings that are featuring within that budget process. So and I think it's absolutely right to do that, because then you get the overall picture rather than just two elements of it, which is what you received tonight.
Right, thank you. Is everybody in agreement with that? Move on to, right. Lovely, thank you. Now, George, you've been waiting incredibly patiently. I realise that we are 35 minutes over time. We'd very much like to hear about the executive forward plan. Are you able to do this within the, how does everybody feel about the time?
I can do it super quick, Chair.
Pardon?
I can do it super quick, if that helps.
Yes, well, we'd still like to hear it, George, but yes, if you just can fill us in on it, because I think it's something that we wanted to have at every
absolutely
at every meeting.
Yeah. So
thank you. Thank you very much.
Chair. So it was circulated.
Before you, so they keep cutting me off. It says I have to keep logging back in. It's 3 times. It's just happened just now. What's going on?
I think Dennis, there has been a problem with Zoom today. Tracy said earlier on that she'd been in previous meetings and had exactly the same problems that you're having now.
Okay, sorry, so George. Carry on. If I
okay.
Get again, I'll have to leave it.
Okay.
All right. Okay, carry on.
Thank you, Chair. So the forward plan has been circulated for the shadow executive, and as you will see, the August papers, as Martin alluded to earlier, they were published this evening. So there's a range of papers coming to the shadow exec on the 25th of August, which is obviously just next week. In terms of the next shadow exec meeting, at the moment, as you'll see on the forward plan, there's just the transformation programme update from Paul Helsby, but you may remember from the session that we had on the 16th of July, the second workshop session, you did want to consider that at appropriate times. So it may be that for the next meeting that we have scheduled, which is on the 8th of September, that we have an update provided by Paul Helsby and Audra Statham on the programme and on the financial performance of the programme, which again I know has been mentioned a few times in this evening's meeting. With regards to the forward plan for the shadow exec, as you'll see, it's fairly light at the moment, and that's because it tends to get set after each joint implementation executive meeting, or at the end of the joint implementation executive meeting. So there's not a great deal to add to it at this stage. What we can do though, and what we will do, is we will circulate the work programme for overview and scrutiny, which we'll hopefully be doing in the next 10 days or so, and that will reflect the workshop session, the second one that we had on the 16th of July. And if you remember there, the three areas that members were keen to focus on was finance, and obviously you've heard an element of that from Martin, Rebecca, Belinda and Paul this evening. But there's also further elements, medium-term financial plan and the disaggregation of the county council budgets as well, which will form an important part of that. So finance was one. The second area was around governance, and within that was a review of the constitution for the new West Northants Authority, and also localism, and specifically those area boards that members were keen to explore in more detail. And then the third area was the transformation programme, which, as I've said, may be appropriate to bring on the 8th of September. But we will get a work programme finalised and circulated round to all members on the committee, so you can see how that starts to take shape for the meetings that we've got scheduled, which, as I say, the next one's on the 8th of September, but then they're every other month through until the 2nd of March. So hopefully that's helpful, Chair, by way of both an update and some suggested agenda items for the 8th of September.
Right, thank you very much, George. And just looking at the timeline, if we start thinking about maybe some sort of recommendations going towards the Shadow Executive on the 24th of November, we have a really short lifespan for this committee. And I think we've got to start thinking about, how we can make recommendations. I know governance is something that a number of people felt very strongly about, and it's an area that we could look at, as George has suggested, to continue along with the finance, the understanding of that. And certainly I think the governance would be a very good area to also to consider. So if that could be worked up into a programme for the committee, and we can send that out. Our next meeting will be the 8th of September, which will come around fairly quickly, and we can start working from there. Dennis,
Yeah,
are you waving goodbye, or are you raising your hand?
No, I'm just, sorry, I'm just saying, I just want to ask a question with Tracy. I'm on a holiday on the 8th of September. Can I send a substitute? Is she there, Tracy? No, I'll ask George. George, can I put a substitute in my place for that meeting?
I'll come back to you, Dennis, on that. We'll check what it says in the Constitution and come back to you if I may. Oh, he's gone.
Okay. Well, I think bearing in mind the time, and thank you very much for staying with us so long. I don't think it's any matter of urgent business. None has been notified. There are no exempt items tonight. None are notified. I'd just like to thank everybody for their attendance, and particularly a huge thanks to Martin, who I think has given us most incredibly full and enlightening presentation of something that is really very complex. So we do appreciate all the work that's gone into that, along with Belinda. And has he left? Sorry, Jamie.
Paul Hymas.
Paul.
Thank you,
Yes.
Chair.
Jamie wanting to come in here.
No, sorry, it's my computer again playing up.
Right, along with Paul and Belinda, and an incredible amount of thanks to Rebecca for coming as well to explain some of the workings of your task and finish group and how you went about this, because there's a lot of work going on behind the scenes for everybody. And again to George, Susan, and again to Martin. and our democratic support, Tracy and Alex. Thank you very much indeed. So if that's all, we can say good night to everybody and conclude the meeting. Thank you very much.
Bye. Good night.
Goodbye.
Good night. Thank you.
Good night all. Good night all.
Good night.
Bye.
Thank you.